Welcome back, everyone, to the Risk Intel podcast, powered by SRA Watchtower, where we share risk intelligence with experts from across the banking industry. I'm your host, Ed Vincent, CEO at SRA Watchtower. Hello, welcome back to the Risk Intel podcast. Please join me today in welcoming Sharon Campbell to her first Risk Intel podcast episode. Sharon, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Sharon, you lead the client services team at SRA Watchtower, and prior to stepping into that role, you have a rich history of leading client-facing teams within a number of different financial institutions and SaaS organizations supporting banks and credit unions, right? So you know this space very well, and I know that really, client experience, client service, client orientation, being client-led is in your DNA, and that's really the area of content that we're going to explore today and over the next couple of episodes here. So let's start out with, I'll say, the kind of fundamental question of what are the functions or areas of responsibility that are encompassed within a client services team itself?
So really, it kind of goes to there is a documented whatever journey. And so in the order of that journey, you kind of think of it in the terms of Maslow's hierarchy, meaning you're addressing the basic needs. And so in the client services function, it's implementation, it's education or training, it's support, it's what's considered relationship management or strategic client advisor is what we call it in our space. Also, it's considered to be like a client support model or mechanism. You also have things such as voice of the client in many of the client-led organizations that are out there. But then sometimes when I am asked this question, another area that I would say is every single department in your organization is really a client service function or is a client service team, whether that's your legal, whether that's your accounting, whether that's your IT or your development. Every single one of those teams has something to do in regards to client services. So how well they code the software to how well they get the invoice out to clients, all of those are client touch points and therefore really part of client services.
I'm going to come back to that concept in a minute because I think it's particularly interesting, especially for many of our listeners and viewers here and their risk teams and how they are servicing the rest of their organizations. But let me park that for a second and pick up on another theme which you just introduced there around being client-led. What does being client-led mean to you?
Oh, thank you for that question. I have a tendency to get on my soapbox, so I don't know how much time we have for this podcast, so just let me know if you need to cut me off at any given time. So you'll hear the term a product-led growth or client-led growth bounced around a lot in client services or client experience industries. Being client-led is really prioritizing the client experience. I mean, it really is that. But it is also making sure that that is something that is driven from the top down. So it's not just one department that's only focused on being client-led. It really has to be a cultural shift for many organizations. And so it is driven from the CEO on down to make sure that the rest of the organization understands that. And part of that is also then developing relationships to align with the client's objectives. And their targeted outcomes. It's not just enough of we need to put out products so that we can make money, and we need to put out product so we can beat out our competitor. We need to put out product in a client-led organization. We need to put out product to be able to solve for the problems what's the problem to solve that our clients have. We're trying to do it to solve for our clients' problems. And so again, being very tightly in tune with what are the needs of the client. It's also very heavily based on listening. One of the terms that I am sure that various teams that I've worked with has heard me say over and over ad nauseum is early and often. You want to engage early and often. You want to listen to what the clients have to say early and often. And that also dovetails nicely into feedback loops. And when I say loops, loops being that key phrase, because a big miss, and I've seen this in other organizations where it's one thing to ask clients for feedback. It's another thing to miss out on doing anything and making that feedback actionable, or going back to clients and say, this is what we heard and this is what we're going to do about it. And so ensuring that there is an actual loop. The other piece is proactive outreach, and being a client-led organization. It is, again, engaging early and often, not necessarily in a reactionary way, but there are departments set aside for that, but at all different types or areas to proactively outreach to clients. Another area is the commitment to continuously improve. And that is not just in software. One of the things that I like to do is to find out, what are we doing well and what are we not doing well? And so you use those, what are you not doing well, as training opportunities or learning opportunities. You want to make sure that you don't rest on your laurels and say, we're good or you're good enough, because somebody at some point, some competitor is going to leapfrog you. And then another one is proactive problem solving. When I say proactive problem solving, that is, again, looking at some of your metrics, looking at your usage. How are clients adopting your application? How are they using it? How are they not using it? Those are the things that you proactively look at, so that you can go in and figure out, what is the next problem to solve that we need to build into our software. And then the other piece is really being insight-driven decisions over data-driven decisions. And the slight difference with that is, insights are actually client-provided actionable objectives or opportunities that you have. And so to really be able to take those in, to take in those insights, and then feed that into your strategic process going forward. And I know I said a lot.
I'm going to try and recap some of that back to you, because I think that there's a number of different principles there, if you will, that come from that question of what does it mean to be client-led, that, again, I'm going to tie back to our risk officers and how they establish a culture of risk within an organization, and how they, as a risk function, service and engage with the rest of the financial institution. So, buying from the top down. Number two, solving the problems that our clients have.
Mm-hmm.
Number three, listening early and often, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of building on that, having a feedback loop in place
Mm-hmm.
that allows you to make that feedback actionable.
Yep.
And I think that ties into a concept of, right, continuous evolution and improvement, and a commitment to that cycle. And then lastly, this concept of being insight driven rather than data driven in your decision making. And I think that's a particularly interesting one. And I think about, within Watchtower, how there's a lot of data that comes into Watchtower that is then manipulated and analyzed,
Mm-hmm.
that yields insight, and that is really what organizations should be using to make decisions. So I think that concept of then empowering teams with insights to make insight-driven decisions is a really interesting distinction, because we hear so much about data-driven decisions, and really the insight is that data having been synthesized and analyzed and evaluated. And that, as you said, then ties back to the strategic plan and the vision of the business.
And yes, and I would also state that data is still data. You need that data, but
Right.
data to a certain extent is just an analyzed feedback, versus
Right.
having that data, having the analysis with it, tying that, and then being able to glean insights out of that. And now you have insight-driven data.
Right. And in order to do that, right, you don't want to be spending all of your time collecting that data, right? You and I spoke to someone yesterday who was talking about the burden of collecting and manually entering data that then keeps you from doing the evaluation and analysis to
Correct.
glean the insight, right? So you've got to get past that data collection has to be as efficient as possible so you can get to the insight step.
Has to be a happy balance. Yes.
Let's You mentioned a few other terms in there that I want to pick up on, and ask you to explain the difference between client services, client experience, which I know is right, a kind of a philosophy that you embrace, and then client success. Take us through how you think about those things. Why are they the same, or why are they different?
Great question, because they do overlap in a way, but it's just a question of how you are referencing them, let's just say in a conversation. And in one of the conferences that I went to, and I would love to be able to give the gentleman credit, who had stated something kind of similar, but the best way of thinking about it is, and I will also share that pretty much all of the analogies I ever give anybody are all related to food. So client services is when you go to a restaurant and the restaurant provides you tables and chairs. There's an employee who brings you water. The waiter brings you an extensive menu, takes your order of various items, delivers delicious food to you. Some other employee refills your glass of water and clears your plates away. That's kind of the experience that you are expecting. That's a decent experience in client services. And that is part of that when I talked about, again, Maslow's hierarchy and just fulfilling some basic need. Client success is when you go to a restaurant and the host offers to take your coat. The waiter proactively asks about dietary restrictions, um, guides you through the menu based on your feedback, shares what's new, continues to engage with you throughout the course of your evening, and throughout the service. That is a little bit more of a touch point. Sometimes you hear white glove service, sometimes you hear concierge service. When it comes to client success, it is more of a proactive approach. And so that's that slight distinction. Client experience is a lot of times has nothing to do with the human interaction. It is, you notice that the restaurant offers you valet service, the amazing lighting, the decor, the chairs are comfortable, the bathrooms are clean, the climate is neither too hot or too cold. All of these things are noticed without any human interaction, and you think this is a really good place that I've landed in, and that is without a in your face, what I would call, but that you just know you've landed in the right location. That is the slight distinction. And so organizations should normally have a smattering, if that's a word, across all three of those, where you do provide a client services function. And so in SRA Watchtower, it's implementation, it's support, it's strategic client advisor. But you also provide that client success functionality, which is really more proactive, which is the what we call, again, our strategic client advisor, of doing that outreach and guiding you and providing some training, letting you know when there are new features and functionalities and such that come out with the tool. And then ultimately there's the overarching experience, and that kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is everyone in the organization from the top to the bottom has the ability to promote that level of client experience that you want clients to receive. It is that level of professionalism. It's the level of being polite. It's the level of being patient. Um, all of those things tie into the client experience, even from a product perspective. It's intuitive. You've listened to clients, and a client can sit down to a tool that maybe they've just seen a demo of and are able to get from A to B or A to Z easily because you've made that user interaction simple and easy and intuitive. All of those things tie into being part of client services, client experience, and client success. All of those things roll in together. Hopefully I did not make you hungry in the process.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great analogy, and I think it brings home the distinction between those three areas. Sharon, I think we've established a strong foundation here, from which to dive into some other topics. So in our next episode, I'm going to ask us to come back and explore the client journey in a bit more detail and maybe dive into a couple of areas there. But I'd ask everyone to think about, as we conclude here, applying these concepts that we talked about here, right? You're talking about it in the context of how are you taking forward the client services function at SRA Watchtower. But it really strikes me that all of these principles apply equally to a risk officer or a risk department, and how that team is interacting with the rest of the financial institution. Right? The goal is to empower and enable the institution to be successful. It is to instill that culture of risk from the top of the organization and have it permeate throughout the organization. It is to listen to those business stakeholders early and often, and to have that feedback loop in place. It is to give them tools to be successful in their day-to-day jobs. It is to problem solve so that instead of being a department of no, you're a how do I get to yes, right? All of these themes really mirror, right, what you laid out there in how a SaaS organization may support a financial institution, but similarly how a risk team would support their financial institution and their business partners.
Yep, absolutely. I would concur.
Thanks, Sharon. Appreciate the time today, and we look forward to having you back and digging into the client journey in our next episode.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.